Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yusuf Munayer. I'm head of the Palestine Israel program and a senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Repression of Palestine Activism Amid the War on Gaza. I also want to thank the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University for co-sponsoring this webinar today. Protesters are being arrested for chanting about freedom for Palestine. Student groups are being shut down, and university presidents are still being berated by Congress for not doing more to silence dissent against Israel on campus. While these trends are not new, we've seen a massive spike in repressive efforts in North America and Europe over the last 2 months as Israel's war on Gaza has continued. We've also seen Palestinian Americans targeted with deadly violence and numerous threats against Palestinians or those perceived to be. Where has this all come from and where is it going? What can we expect moving forward? And what can be done to safeguard the right to dissent and the right to life in a climate of anti-Palestinian hysteria as bombs rain down on Gaza? We are fortunate to have a panel of experts on these issues to talk through these questions and more today. Before we begin, I want to encourage all of our attendees today to check out the various publications and events that we've produced that analyze the ongoing war and the broader crisis from different perspectives. These can all be found on our website, and we'll be sure to add more in the days and weeks ahead. For today's conversation, we'll begin with 8 minutes of remarks from each panelist, followed by moderators' questions, and then Q&A with the audience. Please note that you don't need to wait for the Q&A portion to submit your questions to this morning's speakers. You can send in questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Now, in the interest of time, I want to move directly to briefly introducing our guests in the order that they'll be presenting and then starting the discussion. Abed Ayoub joins us from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, Diala Shamas for the Center for Constitutional Rights, Leila Katterman from the European Legal Support Center, and Asla Bali, a professor of law at Yale and president of the Middle East Studies Association. Welcome, all of you, and thank you for being with us today. Abed, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you all for organizing this very important session. And this is a very daunting time for many in the community, and it's important to focus on how we're being impacted here at home. And there's been no shortage of coverage and our community speaking out about the issues that we're seeing. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the hate crimes and the incidents and what we're seeing come from ADC and the impact that this has on our community. We do hear a lot. You have heard a lot. I'm sure those of you that are listening, you've heard a lot about the numbers and the significant increase in hate crimes and hate incidents, but the numbers don't tell the first story. I think the initial reaction for a lot of people is to compare this to a post 9/11 climate, but I can tell you that it is far worse. The coordinated attacks against our community are very sophisticated and with the intention of silencing Palestinians, silencing Arabs, and silencing those that do support Palestinians. And that is being played out in many areas. It's being played out on college campuses, which I'm sure we'll discuss and get into with my colleagues on this call. It's also being played out in the workplace and also in elementary schools and middle schools across the country. Immediately after October 7th, we began receiving a significant number of intakes from individuals who've been let go of their job, who've been fired, or have been told by their supervisors or managers, take down your post, don't speak up. This didn't happen on accident. This did not happen on an individual, case-by-case basis. This, again, was a coordinated effort that took months, if not years, of planning to turn the switch on and to immediately begin. And it was amplified and helped these employers were given cover because they were helped by the rhetoric, the dehumanization, and the way Palestinians were portrayed in the days and weeks immediately following October 7th. So it gave a lot of the employers cover and a lot of these agencies cover to fire our employees, to kick them out of the workplace. And ultimately that rhetoric is what led to, is what's leading to, hate crimes and the hate incidents that we are seeing. Shortly after the 7th, there was the stabbing of Wadia, the 6-year-old in Chicago, who was stabbed along, with his mom. And the landlord who will show, we are working with the family, it'll show that the landlord was taking cues from social media and wanted to stop the Palestinians and wanted to protect America. Just a few weeks ago, we have the 3 students in Vermont that were shot simply for wearing a keffiyeh. And in between those two, examples, you have many other cases. Now, they may not involve stabbings or shootings, but they do involve physical violence, intimidation, and a serious attempt at inflicting, bodily harm on a number of our community members. This again all ties into, as I just said a few moments ago, into the dehumanization, into the rhetoric that we're seeing, and into the ways Palestinians and Arabs are portrayed. And I can tell you that it is, again, far worse now than it was post 9/11. Given the attacks we're seeing, everything we are seeing, we are more, we're more aligned with a McCarthy era type of hate and tactics than we are in a post 9/11 era. And I think that's significant because that is going to take a different approach in how we address our issues, and in a different approach in how we tackle the hate crimes and tackle the hate that we are seeing. And getting ahead of these, not just through, the typical ways that we did after 9/11, which was, through trainings and interfaith and interfaith conversations. We don't need those. We need a far more aggressive approach to take. We need to start holding those that are inflicting harm accountable. We need to, at the same time, engage with different offices within companies, within corporations, within the employment space to prevent the firings, and bolster our efforts to protect our students on college campuses, which is already happening. You have great organizations out there such as Palestine Legal, CCR, and others that are doing incredible work to protect the students, but it's unfortunately probably going to get worse come 2024 and the election season. And it is a time for the community to pull our resource together, pull our expertise together, and figure out what we can do collectively to address these issues. So again, just to recap, the climate, the dehumanization is real. It is what's leading to the hate crimes. It's what's leading to these incidents, and it will continue in election season. The role that, the role that elected officials play, the role that the administration plays, they do play a big part in this. We do know, they launched their Islamophobia strategy, which again has its own issues. We feel was a cover just to give them, space or to appease some in the community, but that's not working. And the main reason that's not working, and we do got to keep the focus on, it's not just Islamophobia. There is the anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian part to this. And it is important to remember that, and important to highlight that when we are talking about the hate crimes, when we are talking about, 3 young men that were shot for wearing the keffiyeh, that is an anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab hate crime. We cannot allow them to erase, the identity of the victims, or to push away the role that, being Arab or being Palestinian has played. So that is also something we need to keep an eye on, and something that we need to focus on. I'm happy to answer any questions. At ADC, we have been providing direct legal services, working with the families of hate crime victims, trying our best to represent and refer out and connect those that have been fired, that are facing legal issues, legal consequences for their speech and for their standing up for Palestine, doing our best to help them individually, and our work will continue. And again, just appreciate the opportunity to talk about it briefly, and looking forward to a good conversation and answering any questions y'all may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Abed will transition now to Diala.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I was going to speak a little bit about an aspect of the repression that we're seeing, which is the and the sort of weaponization of U.S. terrorism laws and efforts to kind of use those laws to silence Palestinian and voices that are speaking out on behalf of and in support of Palestinian human rights. So I think this was really prominently on display with the headline that the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, had called on college campuses to investigate Students for Justice in Palestine chapters for material support to terrorism. This made a lot of headlines. Civil rights organizations across the country issued a really strong rebuke and rejection of, such kind of dangerous efforts by, the Anti-Discrimination League, nonetheless, calling on campuses to essentially criminalize their student organizations. CCR, the ACLU, so many others wrote letters to college campuses saying there's nothing here, and we should be very wary of using and looking to these expansive terrorism laws that risk silencing. There's nothing unlawful about what student organizations are doing, and universities shouldn't be in the business of policing what students do and say. And of course, a lot of the invocation of these laws are intended to draw on a long history of targeting, Palestinian organizing and protest. We've also seen just since October 7th, the invocation of material support to terrorism laws by private, advocates, I guess Israel-aligned advocates, writing letters to funders, to social media companies, to payment platforms, essentially trying to arguing that they should be deplatforming or defunding Palestinian organizations, accusing those organizations of being associated with terrorism. It's important to note that none of this is new, and that kind of placing what we're seeing now in the context where we know, because our organizations and ADC have been working on this for decades, these efforts are actually building on an architecture and a history of smearing the Palestinian movement, the movement for Palestinian rights and Palestinian solidarity efforts as supports for terrorism. That has been a really long-standing practice. And so it is nothing new. And we're seeing it certainly expand, accelerate. We're seeing it sort of on steroids, but the architecture and the scaffolding that it's being built on is already there. Now, why do I say this? I don't say this to demobilize us, to sort of say, no, nothing new to see here. We can all go about our merry way, but actually because it's really informative. It's informative because we sort of, first of all, it's useful to have that kind of contextual analysis because it tells us a little bit of the playbook. So we know what to expect, which also means that we know where we need to be vigilant and careful. It also reminds us that we have developed some resilience. We have organizations, legal organizations. Palestine Legal was mentioned, ADC, the Center for Constitutional Rights, that have been doing and counseling groups that have come under these sorts of attacks and false accusations for a very long time. And so we have that kind of infrastructure. I want to just offer a couple of thoughts on or maybe just say a little bit of what these laws are. And then to just wrap up, I'm going to try to keep things brief so that we can take audience questions. But I've been saying material support to terrorism laws. What those are a reference to some federal criminal law criminalizing or broadly prohibiting what's called material support to terrorists or to terrorist organizations. Material support has been very broadly defined and construed. So it includes services, and that has included, in turn, things like advocacy, as long as that advocacy, importantly, under Supreme Court precedent, it only includes advocacy if that advocacy is done in coordination with a terrorist organization. So advocacy that is independent of terrorist organization, which is, all of the advocacy that is being smeared as supporting terrorism, is lawful, First Amendment protected, and not covered by these material support to terrorism laws. So it's also, there's been a really there's these laws have been in place. They're criminal laws, and then they've also been expanded to sort of have civil consequences. So criminally means the Department of Justice can initiate investigations against groups, and we've seen groups like Zahor Legal try to write letters to the Department of Justice arguing that student organizations, funders, Muslim organizations across the U.S. are, should be investigated under these really broad laws, and none of these efforts have borne no fruit. Obviously, one of the things that we have been seeing a lot more in terms of trends of the last few years has been the use of the civil provisions by actors like these sort of resource organizations who are trying to silence Palestinian organizing and advocacy, filing lawsuits, essentially dragging or trying to drag U.S. based advocates into court to expend their resources, put them onto the defensive, accusing them of support for terrorism. So we represent the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, who have been sued under these laws. The lawsuit is completely meritless. It hasn't prevented the litigants from trying to drag that case on endlessly. We also see, examples of this that don't necessarily end up in court. So we see a lot of letters filed, sent by these kinds of Israel-aligned advocacy organizations trying to defund and deplatform Palestinian organizations, so invoking these material support to terrorism laws. I guess that's just some context of what we've been seeing, certainly before October 7th, and we're seeing an acceleration of this post October 7th. We do have a lot of infrastructure, and we do have, it's important to remember that so much of this has been, really frivolous. It doesn't stop it from expending resources, from, trying to sort of draw down on and distract from the conversation. But it is, so that is, I think, the sort of biggest risk here is we have to sort of kind of keep in mind that a lot of these accusations are really just doing the work of distraction and confusion. And of course, the primary intent is to chill, to make people feel like organizing and supporting, organizations that are advocating for Palestinian rights is something that is risky, that comes with risk, and therefore people will withdraw. So I think one of the best antidotes to that is, increasing solidarity and really realizing that these accusations of terrorism are have the primary function of isolating or seeking to isolate the movement. And the concept is, of course, one that is, that sounds, it takes all of the oxygen out of the room when you say that word, but it's important to know that it is really wielded very frivolously in a lot of this context. I'll stop here. A couple of other things I wanted to say, but I'm mindful of time, and I'll pass it back to you, Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Diala. We're going to turn now to Leila Katterman with the European Legal Support Center to talk to us a little bit about what they've been seeing in the European context. Leila?
Hey, thank you for having me and for including Europe into this webinar. So just like in the US, the kind of repression we're currently seeing in Europe is the manifestation of its decades-long attempt to connect the Palestinian identity and experience to terrorism and anti-Semitism. The repression of the Palestine solidarity movement in Europe did not start with the latest bombardment of Gaza. The ELC has been monitoring Europe's crackdown on Palestine solidarity aimed at shrinking the civic space, which is the space that is opened by universal rules or values and allows people to influence the political and social structures around them, since its establishment in 2019. However, of course, the more mobilization there is, the more the repression increases. So since October 7th, the ELSC has recorded almost 500 incidents of repression. By incidents of repression, we mean we have 60 different incident types. So they start from loss of employment or suspension from positions, to disciplinary investigations, threats of legal actions, which means fines or legal repercussions for speaking out, but also arrests and detentions, and of course a lot of online deplatforming, and several different methods that are being applied to silence advocates for Palestinian rights. I'd like to highlight here that while we have been dealing with the allegations of anti-Semitism and support for terrorism for decades, what is changing in Europe is that an allegation that is being used lately is the breach of law or policy. And that differs per country, of course, but for example, a lot of it has to do with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, of which 7 of the 10 points refer to criticism of Israel. That is especially the case in the UK. As the ELSC, we have published our reports in which we have spoken about the misuse of that definition at universities in the UK. So out of 40 cases, for example, 38 were dismissed. So the allegations of anti-Semitism were found false when they were legally challenged. The 2 that have not yet been dismissed is because they're still occurring right now. So these 2 cases are not closed. Another point is the anti-BDS legislations passed by the German Bundestag, the parliament, as well as in the UK. But here I want to raise the point that it is actually due to the success of the Palestine solidarity movement in challenging the classic allegations of anti-Semitism and support for terrorism as mechanisms of silencing, that European governments are starting to try to criminalize the movement by passing restrictive laws or policies. I'd say one of the most worrying parts of Europe is Germany. We have received a very huge number of cases from there. The most worrying trend that we've monitored is the threats to citizenship and residency status. So what Germany has been doing is it has attempted to silence the part of its population that has migration backgrounds and especially targeted refugees by threatening them with deportations if they speak out for Palestine. They've also implemented political bans on several individuals which were prominent in the Palestine solidarity movement. And we see this trend also expanding to other countries. So there's talks, for example, in Belgium of making it extremely difficult for Palestinians or anyone of Palestinian descent to gain Belgian naturalization, so citizenship. So we're seeing a bigger crackdown on citizenship laws. It's becoming more restrictive. In Germany, they've Sachsen-Anhalt, which is one of the states, so to say, in Germany, has actually already passed a motion in which anyone applying for residency or citizenship within that state needs to express their support for Israel in order to be able to obtain it. Which of course, is a direct attack on any person advocating for Palestinian rights within that state. It will probably also be passed in other parts of Germany, which is, of course, quite alienating to any Palestinian living in Germany, especially when we consider that Berlin has one of the biggest diasporas, Palestinian diasporas in Europe. I just want to dial back to the beginning. So the first 2-3 weeks after October 7th, and focus a bit more on what has been happening in Germany. So one of the, let's say, biggest crackdowns in Germany, apart from, of course, the classic disciplinary investigations and smear campaigns that have inevitably risen since October 7th, there has been a lot of police surveillance and violence towards anyone advocating for Palestinian rights. There were demonstration bans until October 25th, so people were not allowed to go out on the streets to protest for Palestine, nor were they allowed to carry flags. So police literally hunted down people that were wearing Palestinian flags or carrying them. At some point, we've also monitored them doing the same with people wearing kufiyas. And it went to the extent of the Berlin Ministry of Education sending out an advice to schools, including primary schools, to ban the wearing of kufiyas in schools, and to even notify the police if students do so. The demonstration bans, however, are not unique to Germany, unfortunately. Demonstrations have also been banned in Austria and even France, which is the place of protest, and also the Czech Republic. But the Palestine Solidarity Movement has actively defied these bans by still going on the streets despite the demonstration bans and practicing their right to protest. Of course, the police reacted very violently, and a lot of people were fined or charged for going against the ban. But I think this is also something that should remind us of the fact that when our fundamental rights are taken away, if we do not accept the stripping away of our fundamental rights, it is harder for governments to impose these restrictions and violations. On another note, the ELC, since its establishment in 2019, has actively challenged these restrictive laws and policies, as well as taken several cases of losses of employment to court. And we have a success rate of 95% when these cases are being challenged. But I think to some extent, of course, law is also oppressive tool in the way that they rely on people not challenging these restrictive laws or policies. Whereas for most constitutions, they go against the constitutions and they are violations of fundamental freedoms. So once they are challenged, it is very difficult for them to actually be implemented. Another problem we're seeing here is that a lot of these restrictive policies or laws that have been developed are come in the form of an advice. So they're not actually laws or policies, but more of an operational advice to institutions and authorities. At the LSE, we have a distinction as well in that regards between the actors that attack the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the enablers of these attacks. So the institutions which allow certain individuals or one of the advices that I've talked about to actually suppress Palestinian rights advocacy are the enabling actors. At universities as well, we've had a lot of repression. Especially in the UK, it has come to the extent of a student posting something on social media and having a disciplinary investigation the day after. So the UK universities are also, due to their adoption of the IHRA definition, cracking down on any pro-Palestinian speech on campuses. But of course, in Europe, it very much differs per country. So in the Netherlands, for example, there are barely any disciplinary investigations, but there's something that we call bureaucratic obstacles. So they don't say that students are not allowed to talk about the topic, but they make it incredibly difficult to organize. They impose a lot of bureaucratic obstacles 2-3 days before the event is scheduled to take place to make it impossible for the events to have a wide reach or to be able to go through. So it depends on the countries of which mechanisms are used more. However, what we've also seen in other countries is that the movement has actively defied the bans. When it comes to demonstrations, the mobilization is still very much occurring, and the institutions are also struggling with suppressing it. That is not to say that a lot of people have not suffered greatly from the consequences that it brings when one speaks out. However, I just want to also put in a note of hope in the sense that more and more people have spoken out than we have seen before. And also, as Diana said, a lot of these attacks are aimed at isolating people who advocate for Palestinian rights. So especially when it comes to smear campaigns, which is very widespread in Europe, the aim is to isolate a person from society and to silence them through that defamation and the harm of their reputation. But we've seen a lot of people coming together, standing up for each other when smear campaigns take place, which is also something motivational to see. Well, I will leave more space for the Q&A, so I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Layla. Asla?
Great. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me, Yusuf, and thanks for convening this important conversation. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently serving as the president of the Middle East Studies Association, and I just want to draw attention to the work of the fantastic Committee on Academic Freedom of MESA, which is a longstanding committee with two wings, one that focuses on North America, the other on the Middle East and North Africa, documenting attacks on academic freedom, restrictions of free speech rights and freedom of association rights for students, faculty, and staff at universities and in the higher education sector in general, both in North America and in the region in the Middle East and North Africa. For this conversation, I'm just going to focus on what we've been documenting through CAF-NA, so the North America wing's work. And I want to note that the Middle East Studies Association is a membership scholarly association. It's the largest one in the field of Middle East studies and the preeminent association in the field. We have 2,800 members worldwide, and we convene an annual meeting. And our most recent annual meeting took place about a month into the conflict. It took place actually from November 1st to the 6th, though we marked the month anniversary of the conflict at the meeting. And the thing that came across loud and clear at the meeting from our members from across North America was the degree of assault on academic freedom, the astonishing chill that has taken hold of campuses. And we set up a set of mechanisms to begin to try to both document what's happening, respond to it on behalf of our membership, and think proactively, including establishing an email address for people to to write to us to let us know about things that are happening on their campuses, which is campusclimate@mesana.org. And then the ordinary work of the Committee on Academic Freedom had to be sort of transitioned into almost a triage mode because it's simply not possible to respond to all of the enormous number of assaults on academic freedom that are happening on the question of Palestine and on speech relating to Gaza and criticism of Israel across campuses on North America. And so instead, there's been an attempt to focus on most egregious cases or cases that are representative of particular kinds of patterns that we're seeing, in order that our advocacy letters can also serve as a model of how to respond to the variety of kinds of assaults that we're seeing. So what I think I'll do with my time now is to just go through the kinds of things that we're seeing manifested on campuses in North America that are attacking faculty, attacking students, attacking the capacity to hold events on campuses, and then targeting the central administration of universities with calls for even further restrictions on speech and activism on campus. So beginning with the kinds of repressive actions that are occurring on campuses, and I'm going to just describe generically, but I invite anyone who is interested to go to the Middle East Studies Association website and look at our advocacy tab at the work of the Committee on Academic Freedom, where you will see all of our letters to all of the various campuses where the events I'm going to describe have been taking place. I'm not going to name campuses in this presentation. We've documented the dismissal of teaching assistants and graduate students on the basis of their communication with students in their classes about the distress that those students have been experiencing as a consequence of the conflict, and advising students, particularly those that are losing family members or have ties to individuals in Gaza, directing them to mental health resources on their campus. That was the basis to dismiss and remove graduate instructors from the classroom. Instructors have been placed on administrative leave based on complaints about materials covered in class that connect to the Gaza conflict, although these were materials that were directly related to the subject matter of the course. In addition, we've seen instructors being recorded in their classes without their permission, and those recordings then edited and used on social media in order to initiate viral campaigns against those instructors. In one instance where such recording occurred, the university investigated, found no wrongdoing on the part of the instructors, but they remained on administrative leave and were not permitted to return to complete the teaching of their courses, even though the complaints came from a very small minority of students in those classes. We've seen disciplinary proceedings initiated against a graduate student on the basis of disorderly conduct because this graduate student attempted to ask a question at a public event that was a question that was critical of Israel's actions. We've seen the harassment and threats of physical harm directed against faculty because of their expression of views on the Gaza conflict or expressions of solidarity, even when those expressions are explicitly tied to a mourning of all lives lost in the conflict. And we've also seen a clear failure of university administrators to denounce that kind of harassment or to defend targeted faculty. We've seen direct intervention in the materials being taught in a course that is sort of prior restraint, to have materials removed from a syllabus because a faculty member had become the target of harassment as a consequence of earlier social media posts, and therefore the university saw fit, or the administration of her division saw fit to intervene in the course materials that she was using in her syllabus. We've seen petitions circulate widely across many campuses in the United States, calling for the removal of tenured faculty members as a consequence of their criticisms of Israel. And we've used the conflation of criticism of Israel or anti-Zionist statements, the conflation of such statements with anti-Semitism, used as a basis for these calls for the removal of tenured faculty. Across the board, we've seen a failure by senior university leaders to address or denounce defamation, harassment, threats, and doxing of students, staff, and faculty because of opinions that they have expressed or are alleged to have expressed regarding the Gaza war. There have been instances across the country as well of courageous senior leaders who have quietly found ways to support their students and their faculty in the face of these kinds of strategies. But what we haven't seen is a forthright public defense of the rights of faculty, students, and staff to express their views freely on these topics. Turning from instructors to students, we've seen, and I think many on this call will know, doxing trucks organized by an organization called Accuracy in Media, led by a man named Adam Gullett, that have been driven around campuses, these trucks, with blown up images of the faces and names of students and sometimes faculty, accusing them of such things as being leading anti-Semites, in many instances based not even on speech that these individuals have engaged in, but rather on imputed speech, falsely associating an individual based on their membership in a religious or ethnic group with authorship of a letter, or without any evidence at all, as was the case in one instance in which a dean at a university was targeted, who is muhajiba, on the basis of nothing other than her identity for statements that had never been made, and there was no record of their being made. In that one instance, there was ultimately a private apology issued. We've seen the arrest of students for civil disobedience. And of course, if you engage in civil disobedience, it's with the understanding that you may be subject to arrest. This was in the case of a sit-in. But because the sit-in took place on campus and the arrests were made by campus police, we then saw the campus police take the measure of publishing the names and home addresses of all students who had been arrested, which resulted in the doxing of their families in their hometowns, far from the campus, and obviously without any connection at all to that act of civil disobedience. They came to be exposed themselves to the kinds of harassment that we've seen becoming, unfortunately, all too common on university campuses. We've seen the investigation of students for issuing solidarity statements over email listservs. So university-initiated disciplinary proceedings and investigations, at times involving the removal of students from their elected positions in student governance as a consequence of solidarity statements. Of course, we've seen even more high-profile sanctions against student organizations that have either been suspended or banned from campuses as a consequence of their activities. This has been especially true for campus chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. And oftentimes what we've documented is the ways in which bespoke rules are being generated on campuses on the fly on an ad hoc basis in order to create a kind of tangled web of new procedures and protocols that then make it very difficult for students to comply, even when there's a good faith attempt at compliance, and then the failure to comply becomes the basis for suspension or for the cancellation of events. So campuses adopting these kinds of rules essentially are precluding speech or treating speech on a discriminatory basis when it is expected to be either critical of Israel or expressions of pro-Palestinian views by generating new rules and new conditions for access to parts of campus in order to engage in these kinds of events and speech acts. While it's perfectly permissible for university administrators to set regulations on the time, manner, and location in which events can take place on campus, it is totally unacceptable to do so exceptionally with new rules only for one viewpoint and only for one set of events or one set of voices. This has also resulted in the cancellation of film screenings of the award-winning documentary Israelism in a number of campuses across the country at universities in North America. I just want to say a couple of things about the broader context of external actors imposing this chilling effect on campuses beyond university administrators. The first thing I want to note is a recent event that many may be familiar with over Cambridge, Massachusetts, in which an organization flew a banner over the town depicting the Palestinian flag alongside a message about campus hatred of Jews. Now, this is an attempt by external actors that themselves are supporters of Israel to really render literal the conflation of pro-Palestinian speech with discriminatory speech against the Jewish community that they themselves are engaging in order to gin up essentially a climate of fear with great success. As a consequence of that banner being flown by a pro-Israel organization over Cambridge, Massachusetts, students in K through 12 schools have found themselves having to have counseling because they have felt frightened in the communities that they live in, that these kinds of hateful messages are being flown over their schools, let alone, of course, the effect on the university campuses that are being deliberately targeted by this banner, by this organization. In addition, and as has already been commented on by a number of previous speakers, and of course, Yusuf in his introductory remarks, the chilling effect that follows congressional hearings that basically initiate investigations onto campuses as a consequence, again, of the conflation of speech that is pro-Palestinian or speech that is critical of Israel with allegations of anti-Semitism and the use of and the particular weaponization and demonization of particular phrases as having a meaning that is being imputed, regardless of the intention of the speaker, to the speakers, precisely in order to engineer this kind of a conflation. These congressional hearings were, of course, terrifying and will produce a longstanding chill that will have an effect well beyond this semester, next semester, this academic year, in which university administrators are learning that if they try to defend on an even-handed basis campus speech codes and policies, they will face a very steep potential price, whether it might be the calls for their resignation and indeed ultimately actual resignations, or the creation of a climate on the campus that essentially robs them of their capacity to lead, robs them of their capacity to use their voice because they have been cast under this cloud of suspicion as a result of highly motivated, performative political hearings of the kind that we saw last week. All of this runs the deep risk of codifying the longstanding informal exception to free speech around Palestine into a formally codified rule across our campuses and indeed nationwide around the limitations and constraints on speech, either critical of Israel or supportive of Palestinian rights, as censors are coming after private universities, but also public universities, and increasingly advancing arguments to delimit the First Amendment and its reach in the context of speech having to do with Palestine and Israel. And it's worth noting that this kind of censorship has much broader implications. Those who may favor this kind of censorship today, when it comes to defining a wide array of speech as supposedly genocidal, regardless of the intent of the speaker, may find that they have endorsed a strategy that tomorrow will punish and criminalize and silence dissenting speech that they would otherwise agree with. There are very few lines that can be preserved in the face of the kinds of calls we see today. And I would just point you in the direction of Jonah Gelbach's excellent op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer this week, making this point of how dangerous the kind of chill and the kinds of call for censorship are that we're seeing. To say a little bit about the data that we have about the chill being experienced by faculty, and that was anecdotally reported to us by our members at our most recent annual meeting, there's been a poll run by Mark Lynch and Shibli Tadhami that confirms that of 936 respondents that teach on subjects having to do with the Middle East, 82% of all US faculty and 98% of those who are untenured engage in self-censorship when discussing Israel-Palestine as a consequence of the perception that they will face a punitive menu of responses if they were to speak more openly. There are enormous resonances in these strategies with the broader authoritarian playbook that many have been worried about in this country from the election of Donald Trump to the present. It needs to be said explicitly that this is a part and parcel and an extension of the culture wars against higher education that have been ongoing in this country now for over a decade, but they have been turbocharged in the context of Israel-Palestine, and the stigmatization of Palestine advocacy and the demonization of protest speech around pro-Palestinian or speech that's critical of Israel has really laid bare the extent to which these culture wars, this set of campaigns that range from the anti-critical race theory campaign to campaigns against individuals based on their sexual orientation on campuses, to now the astonishing censorship of pro-Palestinian views or criticism of Israel. All of this is actually fueled not only by an ecosystem of authoritarianism, but also by a range of far-right dark money that drives a portion of these reactions, whether it's online or through the purchasing of doxing trucks or the flying of banners over campuses, and increasingly is also targeting central university administrations, whether through the takeover of university boards, something that has been witnessed very extensively in Florida, or by the use of leverage as a consequence of the increasingly vulnerable political economy of higher education. And I'm just going to stop my comments with this last point on the political economy of higher education. In a co-authored essay on the LPE blog, I joined colleagues in underscoring that a dimension of this moment that is as troubling as it is clarifying. Against a backdrop of financial cuts and eroding public support for higher education, the stakes are incredibly high when corporate donors come in demanding changes in university policies. And when, in addition to such donors, we also see elite law firms, government officials, advocacy organizations, and alumni all putting undue pressure on internal governance of universities and targeting senior university administrators, we produce an atmosphere on campuses that makes most vulnerable the individuals whose economic security is most tentative. So this includes untenured academics, staff, graduate students who are vulnerable, and especially students who are susceptible to economic sanctions for their speech, precisely because they're having to indebt themselves in order to afford higher education in the first place, as a consequence of the broader political economy of higher education that I began this set of comments with. And so with that, let me just stop and look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Asla. I do have a few questions myself for all of our panelists. And I did want to start with you because I know you have to leave us a little bit early. I wanted to ask you about the role of donors, but you got to that at the end of your comments. Can you talk to us if there is a sort of any difference between the way public and private universities are having to sort of calculate the decisions that they're making and what might those differences be?
Yeah, I think there are significant differences because public universities are subject to the First Amendment, and private universities, while many of them state in their speech codes and policies that they either are consistent with the broad understanding of free speech rights under, the constitutional order in the United States, or that they actually themselves observe the First Amendment, they're not actually required to do so, and they can alter their campus policy speech codes and policies at the behest of their own leadership. And so in this moment, there is a far greater risk at private universities than at public universities that you might see overnight substantial changes to the codes that govern speech and conduct at universities. Indeed, as I've already mentioned, we've seen quite a bit of this. The introduction of new ad hoc rules that are limiting the freedom of association and academic freedom to express particular views has been the hallmark, unfortunately, of the crisis, as we've seen multiple universities introduce new regulations, new requirements of reporting to campus, new rules that risk prior restraint by requiring reporting to senior administrators of any event that's being planned that may touch upon this conflict in any way. All of those kinds of rules are possible when the university is applying a private speech code and a private code governing freedom of association, as opposed to having to abide by broader constitutional constraints. Although there too, when you have Congress engaging in the kinds of hearings that we saw, and when you have the possibility of a commission with subpoena powers being convened by congressional authorities to investigate speech crimes, essentially, on campuses, in that climate, the interpretation of the First Amendment might itself become extraordinarily cramped. And Yusuf, since I do have to go, if I could take just one more moment to suggest, in response to one of the questions around the conflation, the equation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which we saw made explicit in the House resolution that passed last week, and that may be coming now in the form of a congressional commission with subpoena powers, I would really recommend to the listeners here a number of resources. One of them is an article by my colleague Noah Zatz at the LP Project blog, again, which is called Palestinian Freedom, Anti-Semitism, Accusations, and Civil Rights Law, which really lays out a very clear account of the law in this area. And another article by a colleague, Nadia Abul-Hajj, in Verso Books blog, in which she discusses the ways in which the ironies of the positions that are being taken at the moment on Palestinian speech, when viewed through the lens of very comparable speech amongst advocates of Israel and those who are advocating a Zionist perspective. And then finally, I would note that we have resources at the MESA website on a campus resources page that really collect a range of articles and statements by associations across the country on this topic. And amongst those, perhaps chief and most important, is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism that I would cite as a reference, which specifically addresses the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism that runs the risk of the dangerous conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and addresses that from the perspective of a range of scholars of Jewish studies and their perspective, and scholars of anti-Semitism and their perspective on how an appropriate definition of anti-Semitism ought to be delimited. So I would really recommend the Jerusalem Declaration in particular to anyone who's interested in that question, which I know was posed to us.
Thanks for that, Aslan. I did want to remind our audience that they can send in their questions through the chat feature here, or by sending an email to events@arabcenter.org. It's quite striking when you hear this enumeration of all of the different forces that are arrayed against students, from the highest ranking elective officials to major donors to corporations to major institutions, in a context where the hegemonic discourse in the United States is already overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. It's quite stunning to see the amount of power that it's being wielded against silencing this activism. I did want to ask Leila, one of the things that Abed mentioned earlier on was sort of a comparison, with the post 9/11 period in the United States, but also to the second Red Scare and McCarthyism here in the United States. And I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting and unique about this moment that really, separates it from that moment is that, while you had, of course, anti-communist sentiment around the world, the Second Red Scare was a particularly American phenomenon. What we're seeing today is remarkably transnational, right? We are seeing the same kinds of things against Palestine activism in Canada, against Palestine activism in Europe. This is not limited to the United States. I was wondering, Leila, if maybe you can comment on sort of the intersection between the politics of anti-Palestinian repression with the politics of right-wing anti-immigrant nationalist politics in the European continent.
Can you hear me? Yeah?
We can now, you're low. Yeah.
All right. Yes, sorry about the tech issues. Yeah, to answer your question, Yusuf, I think it's the repression we're seeing in Europe is not surprising considering the rise of far-right parties all across Europe. While, of course, the US context differs to some extent, when it comes to migration and identity politics, Europe is pretty close to how the US weaponizes identity and religion. Germany, of course, has its own historical context, but it's not specific to Germany. The repression is widespread. Also to countries which do not have the same role as Germany in the Second World War. However, the Islamophobia in Germany has been steadily increasing, and that is not just post 9/11 a trend, but that has also been a sentiment before. And with the rise of the far-right parties, Palestine has been kind of the case study that politicians and the media like to use to dehumanize and to dehumanize not just Arabs or Muslims but migrants. So, for example, when they comments on in European media on pro-Palestine protests, it is always in the voice, well, in the wording of these migrants, these young and angry Arab men. So it is very much based on migration politics, and also I think especially in the aftermath of the waves of refugees that came from the Syria after 2011 in Syria, due to the internationalization and increase of migration and refugees in Europe, Palestine is still kind of used as, let's say, the poster child of dehumanization, let's say. So there has been a big trend of connecting pro-Palestine advocacy to Islam, but to make it a religious issue, but also to connect it to terrorism, of course. So there has been a lot of, when it comes to the media, but also to public statements by politicians in almost all countries all across Europe. Palestinian rights advocacy has been framed in the terms of connected to violence, essentially. Connected to violence and connected to, let's say, the old school colonial barbarian threats that non-Europeans are pictured as in Europe. So I would say that not only in terms of the politics in Europe, but also especially in the media, there's kind of these colonial mainstream narratives that are applied to any kind of reporting surrounding Palestinians, whether it is in the West Bank or Gaza, but also if it is about Palestinians here or anyone who stands up for the rights of Palestinians.
Thank you for that, Leila. Diela, I wanted to ask you, can you talk a little bit about, you talked about sort of, allegations of material support and how absurd some of these meritless claims are. But even in cases where you have these calls to investigations around meritless allegations of connections to terrorism or what have you, you still see institutions often coming under pressure to carry out investigations, and the process of that investigation itself can take time and so on. Can you talk about the repressive impact of just the process of an investigation itself, and also how this climate of institutions being pressed to do things like this may lead them to take other types of actions, even if they don't end up, conducting investigations around material support, but perhaps finding other ways to satisfy these kinds of calls for repression?
Thanks, Yusuf. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is important to keep in mind is so much of the operating kind of what's when we're talking about material support to terrorism threats. There's like the formal threats where that ultimately might be through litigation on the docket, and then there's an entire universe of off-docket action, and this is the stuff that's like less visible, but just as, if not more harmful. And what some of these, as Asla was describing, really well organized and well funded organizations and institutions are doing is that they're taking advantage of essentially what is the risk averseness of the private sector. So if you're a bank or if you're a funder, and you're receiving letter after letter saying, we believe that you're in violation of U.S. laws. That bank is going to call its compliance people internally, and they're going to run through, do all the legal research and write the legal memos and do additional rounds of due diligence and so on and so forth. And at a certain point, those private organizations and institutions, that bank will decide that account is not worth their time. And it's just a cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day. And so that's the weakness in the system these groups are taking advantage of. These are not morally or politically or ideologically aligned or driven organizations. They're profit-driven organizations. And so at the end of the day, it's going to be a cost-benefit analysis. As someone in the banking sector once put it to me, that certain accounts were just outside their risk appetite, which is, a very, banking way of putting it, I suppose. So that's really where I see the real risk. And I think that similar calculuses are being made every day, across different organizations and maybe academic institutions. Like at some point, if you keep receiving these threat letters, if you keep getting, dragged into investigations that ultimately might not go anywhere, like you're going to slowly self-censor or stop engaging in the thing that attracts all of that negative attention to you or your organization or institution. So that's kind of the main way in which we see this operate. And I think there's really only one solution, which is to build resilience and also kind of really show that this is something that is a pattern, and also demystify what a lot of these false allegations and false accusations are. Like, it's very scary if you're an in-house lawyer at a small company and you receive a letter that looks serious, raising all these terrorism allegations. It could, it's scary. But if you receive that letter and then you actually realize it's part of a campaign that, has over and over raised these meritless claims that when they've been investigated, they've been found to be baseless, you might be more willing to, keep that account or not deplatform, whatever the target of that letter is. And so I think that's one of the things that the kind of infrastructure to build resilience needs to look like. Of course, in addition to, I think, long term, this moment really highlights the need to rethink the scope of these laws, and the fact that they've been interpreted and pushed to such a broad interpretation. I think in moments where all of these forms of, like at a time where the reality that we're seeing now wasn't fully known or on display. Does that make sense? So I think that there's a need to sort of engage in policy work that kind of puts forward the real chilling effect, the documents and some of the ways that Asla was laying out, real impact of these overbroad possible interpretations and these uses of these laws, and start really engaging with policymakers to fix them, because they are, chilling people's ability to engage in really important political conversations, central political conversations of our time.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, I'm thinking to myself, it was interesting to watch, the show trial is what I call it in Congress, that congressional hearing with the university professors, and it made me think there was a time when it was really usually students and isolated student groups that were being the target of these things, and now we're seeing the presidents of universities being dragged before these kangaroo courts to be publicly shamed and even threatened with losing their jobs. We know the president of Penn has resigned, and I think as of this morning, the president of Harvard is not being forced out, at least not yet. Is there a point, you think, in your view, where these institutions say, all right, we're done with this, like enough of this bullying and intimidation? What do you think it takes to get to that?
I don't know, but it's a really good point that you raised, because I agree. It does feel like there is a bit of a tipping point happening. And, we say this over and over. The best indicator of the success of a political or a social movement is, the level of repression that it is being faced with. And I'll give an example that, to me, it's so, just to say, it's really hard in a moment like this. It's a very dark time where people are really afraid, watching horrific things happen in Gaza, to try to see lights at the end of tunnels or silver linings or anything like that. I mean, it's almost an impossible mental exercise to try to engage in. One moment that to me was very jarring was when the ADL came out with that letter to universities calling on them to investigate Students for Justice in Palestine. And, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, as well as many, many other civil rights organizations, but the ACLU had to come out and oppose them. And I say that because, campus organizers, student groups, Palestine movement actors have been for years trying to talk about the ADL's extremely it's very long track record of trying to silence social justice movements, not just the Palestinian movement, but many other movements here in the US. And there's an excellent toolkit by the Drop the ADL Coalition that was put out, laying out that very long history that dates back to the 90s. And it was a really hard conversation for people to try to have and engage with, especially in progressive circles. And then suddenly that the ADL is, clearly aligning itself with organizations that are deeply right-wing organizations in the United States. So people have been saying that for a very long time, but that hadn't reached the mainstream. So if it's helpful to kind of look at that moment and think that maybe the tides are turning. And again, it's very hard to try to see that in this moment where the repression is really intense and heavy, and the costs are so high.
Yeah, thank you, Diala. Abed, I wanted to ask you, can you talk about, you talked about the role of statements of elected officials that are contributing to a climate of dehumanization. Can you talk about some specific examples that have been particularly part of the problem over the last couple of months?
Sure. And, I think it's important beyond just the specific examples. One key point is what the airwaves were full of, right? That initial week or so after October 7th, you did not see any or hear any Palestinian voices on, mainstream media or traditional media networks like CNN, Fox. It was a complete, the complete coverage had Israeli officials that were, putting hatred out there, putting their talking points out there that was going unchecked. And a lot of the, for example, the beheading of babies and the misinformation and that being repeated by the president. So a lot of the coverage was just ignoring the Palestinian perspective from the beginning. And in a way, that's what led to, the strong Palestinian presence, I believe, on social media and getting things out there in real time, which, now, of course, the hit back on that is the silencing and the, trying to shadow ban and so forth. But just not having the Palestinian perspective, not having that human perspective of the Palestinian community, and then having basically, they literally had, Israeli generals, Israeli military leaders on these networks giving their points and filling the airwaves unchecked. So misinformation, again, the beheading of babies was going viral, it was picking up. And, no apologies week later, no taking back of the statements weeks later. So that type of rhetoric, those type of actions, that's what led to the climate almost instantly, almost immediately. We noticed, at least at ADC, that this is going to be, this is going to lead to, a significant increase in hate crimes and incidents against the community. So by, sometimes the dehumanization doesn't need to happen with words. Sometimes it can just happen by not giving that voice or not giving that perspective. And in this situation, we had both, where the Palestinian Arab voices were silenced. Many guests were pulled off air before they were supposed to do interviews. Many interviews didn't even make it to air. The silencing on social media, the banning. And then you had, along parallel to that, the language and the misinformation and the dehumanization that was being used. And that cultivated an environment really quickly that was very anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian.
Thanks for that, Abed. I want to follow up with a question that comes from one of our audience members here. You had talked a little bit about employee discrimination, people being terminated, and so on. Do we know of situations where employers have backtracked or walked back on their firing of employees? Are individuals who were fired eligible for unemployment? And is there sort of an option to do some sort of class action freedom of speech claim in this regard?
That's a great question. The employment area is one of the most misunderstood in this area. So I'll start with the benefits, and that it's going to depend on each individual's case and the circumstances around their firing, the state they're in, and what's available. So we can't really answer yes or no. What we have seen in some situations are, severance packages now that are starting to be given. And we're also seeing not complete walkbacks of the firing, but kind of the employer going back to say, hey, let's engage in something. Let's give you something so you can leave quietly. Like we are seeing those, but I've yet to see or work with somebody that's had a complete walkback or has been completely rehired. A class action may be difficult, again, given just how diverse the workplace is, the number of employees, and the different circumstances with each. But there are folks out there that are challenging and that are doing their best to push back. The purpose, I think the question what the individual is getting to is, can a class action prevent this from happening? What we have to look at as a community is, if you take this as an assembly line, the cases and the firings is the end of the assembly line. That's what's coming out. It's what could we do at the beginning of this assembly line to stop the firings from happening in the future, to have a better culture and climate in the workplace with DEI professionals, with HR professionals, and engage with them so they can get a better understanding of who we are and who the Arab community is and the Palestinian community is. Now, we have engaged with Fortune 50 companies, Fortune 20 companies, about their best practices, about how they engage with the communities and what we can do to empower Arab and Palestinian employees in the workplace. And we have had successes in some very large corporations pushing back on the ADL anti-Semitism pledge and pushing back on the push for them to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. So we are now, a couple months out now, we are seeing that these DEI professionals, these HR professionals, they really don't want to be involved in geopolitical politics. They don't want to be involved in this issue. They're focused on a environment in the workplace that's welcoming for everyone. But what we believe was missing was that work at the beginning, explaining to them who we are, pushing back on some of these policies. And they've been far more receptive than we anticipated. We thought we would get pushback or they wouldn't be interested in meeting. But there has been a welcoming reception and feel to us. So that's what we have to keep pushing on, and at the same time provide, support to those that need it. And understand this again. Everybody's employment situation is different, and at times, what you say, or even if you say something that is not at all controversial, you may not always have, the law on your side. That's why you need to understand the employee handbook, what the social media policies are in your corporation and where you work, and try to have a conversation with your HR folks if you are worried or you are concerned. But if you are contacted or if you feel like somebody is watching you or threatening you or screenshotting your post, then you should file your complaint initially and say that you feel threatened. So there's a lot of ways to handle it. Again, all of them are different. I don't want to give too much legal advice, but legal@adc.org, and we can walk you through it if you need it.
Thanks, Abid. Diala, there's a question here in the chat about anti-terrorism laws that I want to get you to answer. The audience member says that they used to work on remittances to Somalia, and because of anti-terror laws, it became hard to do things like sending money to families and to support their basic needs. And they're wondering how this might impact Palestinians. And I know that, so many people have been looking at the just horrific situation in Gaza and asking, how can we contribute? How can we help? Who can we give to? And obviously there's going to be hopefully as soon as possible a time where we can begin talking about reconstruction in Gaza, and that's going to be incredibly complicated and always has been. Can you talk about the complications these anti-terrorism laws present?
Yeah, absolutely. And Yusuf, feel free to also chime in because I know you've also thought a lot about this. So in terms of remittances and the question, it's certainly something that is not likely to happen. It's been happening for a very long time. Like Somalia, Palestine is one of the areas that is just considered to be high risk by banks. And so things like getting bank accounts or getting transfers has become increasingly difficult for not only people, private individuals, but also, more larger institutions. And the amount of due diligence that is required is often just beyond what's possible for these organizations to do. And so, it's just increasingly difficult to do things as specific as transfer money. That said, it's not impossible, and there's just a couple of things I would say. Like with any giving that people are considering making to places that we know are heavily scrutinized, it's important to be careful and cautious. And so there are several resources out there that will just advise people who want to be finding ways to support and give to Palestinians and to efforts to support Palestinians either in this kind of acute humanitarian moment or more generally around just like best practices. So it's always a case by case kind of assessment. So I don't want to like give broad advice on the webinar, but a few organizations that will do just individual advising, the CLEAR project, creating law enforcement accountability and responsibility, have been doing a lot of this. They've also done some Know Your Rights workshops. And also I know that various CARE chapters and several others are doing sort of charitable giving advice in this moment. I think in general, it's if you're giving to a 501c3 that's registered in the United States, that's perfectly safe and encouraged, and you know, no risk there. I think the problems sort of increase if it's not a 501c3 or if it's a nonprofit that's registered overseas. So that's the short answer.
Thank you, Dia. Layla, if you could very briefly, you know, you mentioned at the outset of your comments, and I know you work in monitoring for the LSC, something like 500 different incidents over the last couple of months, and 60 different incident types. Is that data available? I know it's something that you guys are tracking consistently. And if it's not available now, is there a plan for when it might be available? And also, Abed, there's a question that came to us in the chat about where people can go to find more information about statistics on anti-Arab hate crimes and so on. So, Layla, if you want to take that first, and then Abed.
Yes, so the LSC has been monitoring incidents of repression for quite a few years. We are planning on publishing a publicly accessible database within next year. So we don't have the exact date yet, but we will be publishing it on our websites. So if you follow us, you will be up to date about the visualization of the data and publication. So yeah, it should be.
As far as the, you know, the data on what we're seeing, you know, you could try ADC, adc.org. We're going to be releasing our data near the end of the year once we compile everything, our intakes and our tracking. You also have Palestine Legal that's regularly putting out their data and stats on the cases they're seeing on college campuses in the workplace. And CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, on their website, they've also released the data that their offices are going through. We are in constant contact with the other organizations and try to give as accurate as a number as possible.
Thank you for that, Abed. One question I would sort of ask, all of you, as you all work in one way or another in sort of documenting, recording, analyzing these trends. What is it like to do that in moments like this? We're talking about a tremendous resource disparity. Could you talk to us about the challenges of trying to deal with inundation in moments where we see such significant spikes, and how much doesn't get recorded because of the lack of resources and the tremendous amount of incidents that do take place? And that's a question that all three of you should feel free to chime in on.
Look, the lack of resources is a big part of it. The other part of it is in a crisis like this, the problems and the issues coming from so many directions, it's difficult to keep up. And it's difficult to understand how much is not being reported. That's the important part, Yusuf, that you mentioned, and that is we do got to keep that in mind. There are a number of cases and individuals who do not want to report or who do not want to go forward or contact ADC or give an official documentation or file an official complaint with what happened. But it's tiring. And again, the other side is outspending. But we are maintaining, we are pushing back, and we are trying to do the best that we can. And I think this time around, the organizations have really put forward a good effort, but it is inundating. It is tiring because of how many directions it's coming from the workplace to college campuses. And then you have your general just hate and discrimination that's happening. But trying to manage all of that, it can take its toll on the resources. And collectively, though, as a community, I think we are working, in a good way to handle it.
Yes, I think just as Ahmed said, for us it's quite the same. It does take its toll on us, and it is also very important to mention that while the ASC has recorded almost 500 incidents since October 7th, there's hundreds, if not thousands more that are not on our radars. So not only are people afraid to report the attacks that have happened, but also there's a kind of also there's a disparity within reach, of course. So not everyone knows about the ELSC. Not everyone has access to our websites or social media. So a lot of incidents go unreported, especially when it comes to migration cases, which are often people just arriving to Europe, people who might not speak English, which is the main language we operate in, although we try our best, despite our lack of resources, to overcome the linguistic obstacles and publish in as many European languages as possible. So yeah, there's a big issue when it comes to the lack of resources, but also in reaching people.
Could I just jump in and make a pitch for, it's, yes, we're not getting a lot of these reports. I sort of fully agree. I think we all probably know people in our lives who've been experiencing some form of suppression that have not gone to any of the organizations that to seek help. There is a range of reasons for that. I think part of it is fear, and part of it might just be also resignation to that this is just a part of doing the work or speaking out on behalf of Palestinians. And I just want to say it's really important for us to report, because this data is significant, of course. It allows you to turn this sort of onslaught of repression into policy advocacy avenues that are desperately needed, as we push back. But I also think that we as a movement need to start thinking more about reporting through formal mechanisms. So we are maybe okay about reporting for ourselves, reaching out to ADC, CARE, Paralegal, ELSC if you're in Europe. But what we know, the other side is doing very well is constantly reporting to local authorities, federal authorities, the Department of Education. And those numbers, those incidents shape policy. And oftentimes these are incidences, that we know well that like an instance will be reported and then clocked by, let's say, an FBI agent as an anti-Semitism investigation or allegation or complaint. But actually, somebody didn't like seeing a pro-Palestine protest or some Palestinian flags in the street or on the campus or something like that. And so then what that results, though, is you have the FBI saying that they have a huge peak of FBI of complaints around anti-Semitism, and then that becomes, that gets taken and transformed into resource allocation policy. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not actually advocating that we all call the FBI and report every single one of these anti-Palestinian incidents. I don't necessarily think that's wise, but I do think that we should be thinking about making sure that we're formally registering with, the authorities, even if we know that it's not going to result in immediate assistance or it's not going to, necessarily be taken seriously, but we have to be thinking about creating a paper trail of whether it's harassment, anti-Palestinian incidents, and other forms of, repression that people are experiencing.
Thank you very much for that, Diala, and we'll have to leave it there for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us in our audience and engaging with our speakers. Thank you to our panel for being so generous with your time and insights, and apologies to anyone whose question we did not get a chance to answer in time. Please continue to follow the center's work at arabcenterdc.org. We wish everyone a good rest of the day.